All right, yeah, I'm super excited to have the chance to talk about some of our latest work and also give, like the talk is also intended to give a bit of a broader kind of half tutorial, half kind of overview of some really cool recent work in the space of object-centric controllable scene representations. And so this, I think, ties in nicely with the problem of learning representations for robotics. Like controllability is really at the core of robotics. And controllability, not just in terms of like interacting with objects, but also like really having representations that support that kind of interaction, as you can see in this kind of teaser video here on the left-hand side, which I'm going to go into more detail later in the talk. And so just to start off a bit with a bit of an introduction of like what in my view is like the goal of learning object-centric representations. And so the goal is really to abstract and represent objects with neural nets. And so why should we care about that? And if you just look at the world around you, just very intuitively, like if you look at like street scenes or even any kind of physical apparatus like this Newton's cradle here, you very much kind of intuitively reason about these systems in terms of like entities, objects, their interactions, their dynamics. Like you can very well imagine what happens next in this kind of bottom right Newton's cradle example. And you kind of intuitively reason in a compositional way about these interactions. Like if I would swap out like one of these balls with a different kind of entity, you kind of have a physical model of these interactions. And so objects are really core to human perception through whatever mechanism. We don't fully understand the mechanisms behind that, but they're really core. And so that alone is like an interesting kind of motivation for trying to address, like, ask this question of kind of how can we do that in neural nets? How can we get objects into neural nets? How can we learn about objects? And are they really beneficial for some kind of downstream tasks? And so one thing that's pretty clear is like interpretability. Like if you want to interpret what a model is doing, because objects are so kind of intuitive for us, interpretability is like one of the core kind of benefits you get out of something like that. But then I would argue also controllability. Like if you care about kind of interacting with the world or building robots that do something in the world, you typically want them to do something with like with objects or with entities or with humans or animals. And so really like the components of the world that you can change and have an effect on. And the same for generative models. Like we've seen massive advances in text to image and text to video models. But like text isn't like the ideal interface for a lot of the things we want to control. And so the big question is kind of how can we get like that fine-grained level of controllability that's so natural to us into these kinds of models. And so if you look at like the history of the field, how people try to address this problem in the context of neural nets, this is a really great review article by Klaus Greff and others on the binding problem in neural nets that made this nice figure. And it's really about like the community sort of converged on this problem understanding in terms of you have some kind of unstructured input like images or videos. And the goal is really to learn per object representations, like really segregating this unstructured input into some kind of structured representation via some kind of structural constraints, either via the architecture, via the learning process, via labels, or whatever like your creativity can come up with. And so this is often done, of course, with the help of human supervision, like the whole kind of object detection literature and computer vision is basically at the core of this. But even unsupervised, you can address this problem and ask the question, okay, how can you learn about this structure even in the absence of any kind of human label supervision? Because we typically also learn about the world without seeing tons of kind of annotated objects. Well, maybe we do with like parents pointing at things, but who knows? And so like the community has more or less converged on a number of ways of representing objects and kind of incorporating the structure. And typically this is in the form of slots.
Share your slides.
Oh, it's not shared on the screen. Oh, 1 second. Let me do that. Share screen. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. 1 second.
Yep.
Yeah. Right, and so the community has kind of converged on a number of different structures on how we represent objects, and especially in the unsupervised learning community, we typically call these slots. And there are things like sequential slots, spatial slots, or instance slots, and you might recognize a lot of them from like the supervised computer vision object detection literature. Like you have things like Pix2Seq, which sequentially detects. You have things like RCNN, which kind of detects in like the spatial slot kind of way, and then you have things like detection transformers, which is more like the instance slot equivalent. And in practice, sequential slots are really ordered sequence of vectors. That's kind of the underlying structure. Spatial slots are grid of vectors, and instance slots are a permutation invariant set of vectors. And especially, I think the final two are getting a lot of popularity with transformers, but you also see a lot of like, especially with like vision language models, people are revisiting the sequential slot paradigm. So there's a lot of choices you can make. I just want to, because everyone's typically familiar with like the supervised literature in the space, I want to talk a bit about self-supervised methods, really in this kind of sub-community of object-centric learning. And so like this started about 2016 with methods like such as attend, infer, repeat, or Monet that really sequentially populate the slots in a fully unsupervised method. And things like spatial slots like spare and space, they're a bit like an unsupervised equivalent of like RCNN and these kinds of approaches. And unsupervised in the sense they really are generative in nature. So you abstract away into some latent space, and then you go back into pixel space via some generative decoder or a deterministic decoder. And then finally, you have instance slots, which really try to use a set of representations as the underlying core representation, starting with methods like iodine and one of our work, slot attention, which is an attention mechanism to do that kind of process. And before we go a bit more into method details, I just want to give like a bit of a teaser of like what these unsupervised methods, what you can expect from them. So like it remains to be kind of said that like supervised scaled data collection and large architecture training is the way to go for like solving these tasks like segmentation, detection, and so forth. But it's still very interesting to see like what just by like architectural inductive biases, what you can get in terms of like objects popping out as individual components of the scene, and really like pixels being routed to individual slots in these representations, like in these 3D scenes, in these driving scenes, but also in more real world kind of image, web scale image data sets with methods like dinosaur and follow-ups that get some kind of grouping in terms of objects in these representations. Now, I very briefly want to touch upon two methods in this instance slot type of approach, because they're relevant for the rest of the talk. And so instance slots, just to repeat that, are really like the underlying structure is a set of representations, and you want to route individual kind of regions of an input image into a set of tokens. And so one token typically then corresponds to one object. And you can see for this iodine method here, the examples of like how it routes the individual kind of objects into individual slots in their representation. And in set-based approaches, this typically has to be done via iterative refinement. So you need to start with some kind of initial guess, and you iteratively update it, either via recurrent update or just via multiple kind of transformer layers, something like that. And in iodine, this was done like not using attention mechanisms, but really using kind of a feedback mechanism where you encode and then decode back into pixel space, compute some gradients, and keep on updating. And while it worked really well, it's very inefficient because you have to run encoders and decoders like multiple times per iteration of these updates. And like for a single frame of an image, and if you want to do it for video, it gets very expensive. And so when we started looking into this problem, we thought, okay, how can you radically speed that up? Can you get away with just one single call to an encoder and a single call to a decoder, and do all the work in this kind of latent module that routes from pixels to these slots, and following the same parallel and iterative paradigm, but simply using cross attention to do the heavy lifting. And so the key here in the absence of supervision was to do cross-attention with an inverted attention mechanism, where the softmax is normalized over the query axis instead of the key axis, which basically means that individual pixels have to decide to which slot they belong. And that competition mechanism really kind of, that's typically sufficient to encourage some kind of grouping in these representations. And we then decode those slots and get an image back. And so just to dive a bit more into slot attention, you typically start from an image, you encode it into some kind of feature map, and then you run T iterations of this cross-attention mechanism. It's really very simple cross-attention with like inverted softmax primarily. And finally, you take these representations and you decode back into pixel space, and you have a bunch of choices for how you can decode. You can either, again, decode using cross-attention. You can decode on a, like, you can decode every single slot individually using a CNN and recombine at the end, which is what we've done here. But ultimately, what you get out of that is, like, on these relatively simple scenes, the model does exactly what you want. Like on Clever here, it really captures every single object in a single token or a single slot. And you can perfectly inspect what is captured. And it also covers things like occlusion. Like if you remove like a slot that is occluding an object behind it, that object behind it gets fully revealed. So it has a full representation of the object and understands something about like the 3D nature of the scene. Now, images, of course, aren't like the only thing we care about, especially for robotics. You kind of want to model videos or model the 3D world. And so one big question is kind of how do you extend this paradigm to video? And this is pretty difficult for grid-based representations and for these sequence-based representations that I've shown earlier, because you don't really have a correspondence over time. But using these instance slots or set-based representation, there's a very simple solution. You basically just use the slots of the past time step as initialization for the next frame. So if you use like slot attention or an attention mechanism, this just means that the inferred objects of the last time steps are just the queries for the next frame. And so the object itself queries into the representation of the next frame and pulls out the same object again. And so if you just apply this on some simple robotics videos, then this is kind of what you can expect. If there's simple backgrounds, not many textures, and the scene and the camera movement is fairly static, then this is the kind of output you can expect from these models. So as you can see, every color here is one object token, one object slot. The model decomposes a scene and consistently over time tracks like the important component. Now, of course, like the entire community has struggled with like really scaling this kind of learning paradigm to very complex in the wild videos. Like addressing this problem is really not the goal of my talk. There are really great works out there that make great progress. But of course, like we know if you inject a bit of supervision, you can really like bridge this gap quite well. And maybe just this one last point here. So again, with this kind of simple mechanism, you get tracking of objects for free, which is quite interesting. Now, if you want to do the same thing in 3D scenes, like multi-view observations of the scene, which of course are very related to video, and also important for robotics, where you maybe have like a multi-view camera setup of the scene, then you can also use the same method in combination with, say, NURBs as decoders. So you just take a per object NURB as a decoder, and you put slot attention in the beginning after the input image forward pass, and again, you get object decomposition on these relatively simplistic scenes, and the model really like nicely segments out the individual objects in the scene, and then you can start manipulating that. So the main reason we're here, of course, is like robotics and control. And so the questions I want to ask in the rest of my talk are really about like controllability. So the first question I think that's really important is how useful are these representations actually for robotic control? Like we often make this assumption, okay, we humans kind of think in terms of objects and causal representations, but how useful are they really for robotic control? And do we already get a lot of these benefits from just like the structural architectures we have, like vision transformers? They also have a set-based representation structure or grid-based representation structure. So we might just get a lot of this for free. And research question number 2 is how controllable are these object representations actually themselves? Like, for example, can a user control them to control the output of a generative model? And this becomes really relevant because generative models are getting really good. Like you have amazing image and video generative models, and so far we primarily control them via text or via kind of in-painting or like pixel-based control. But can we really control the underlying objects in the scene? That becomes a really, really relevant question. And so I want to start by talking about robotic control. And there have been quite a few success stories, and I'm just going to highlight one here, especially in the limited data regime. And that's always the important caveat to keep in mind, that a lot of the things you see where these representations help right now are in a limited data regime. And we really have to figure out how to go beyond that, or whether it's kind of the right thing to do. And so, for example, in this Palmy work, which the main story of Palmy was to combine VIT22B, like this large-scale vision transformer, with a robotic policy, or with like image inputs. And so it can answer questions like how to stack the yellow object on top of the green plate. And like in a number of comparisons in the small data regime on this kind of simplistic, not very textured synthetic task here, there was an interesting result where the authors compared a VIT4B model that was pre-trained on, say, image and style pre-training, or even larger data sets, and OSRT, which is an object-centric scene representation transformer. It's a self-supervised model that learns object slots. And the interesting result is that the object-centric representation really won by a big margin across most of these tasks. But again, this is using kind of a small training data set, I think only like 2,000 demonstrations, something along these lines, and overall, like not like the largest scale pre-training, like it's not the 22B model. So the comparison here is like not entirely conclusive. That being said, there's an interesting data point for a success story. And so the big question now is like, how do we keep these benefits as we scale? Like as we scale these models, and now of course we have massive like vision language models or vision language action models that really are trained on massive data sets. The question is really like, do these additional object-centric models or inductive biases really make a difference here? And I don't know the answer. And so on top of that, if you do self-supervised learning, like the reality is that it's actually difficult to decompose complex scenes without supervision. And so that's also something like, of course, many people are working on, and really a question kind of we should try to get to the bottom of, because it's also really interesting from a kind of human object understanding perspective, because we kind of reason in objects. These models, these large models, probably don't explicitly reason in objects, and how to kind of make this connection. So that's all I want to talk explicitly about robotics. And I want to, for the rest of the talk, go a bit into this problem of controllability of the object representations themselves. Like, how can we control object slots, for example, for tasks like image editing? And so the problem is that these slots, as we've defined them so far, and most of the community defines them, are just unstructured vectors. And the same is mostly true for like the supervised equivalents as well. Like if you look at segment anything, like the per object representation is a single vector, just like in these unsupervised object representation learning methods. And now if you want to start kind of controlling these or editing these, you suddenly don't have too many options. There's some simple solutions, and these simple solutions typically include things like object deletion. You can just remove one of those tokens or slots and see what happens. And very often something interesting happens. So that's good news. Or you can do object transfer or slot surgery, as we call it. Sometimes you take one token from a different scene, you infer it, and you just plug it into a different representation, and you render that scene again. And typically that object gets kind of teleported into a new scene and rendered in that new scene. So those things, those are the kind of edits you can easily do if you have unstructured vectors. But of course, in practice, we really want to go beyond that. We want to control kind of all kind of fine-grained aspects of that. And one solution, of course, is to interface with language and just to make this mapping, let language control these unstructured vectors. But then of course, like how do we get the data for that? There's no kind of scalable way, at least for now. I just want to like give some examples of like the simplest form of object level control. What happens if you take one of these object-centric generative models, at the example of a recent method we just presented at iClear a few weeks ago, called dorsal. There you can delete individual slots, and then like the objects disappear in the scene. Like here, these are street view scenes that we trained the model on. And then we take that street view scene, we just remove a single slot, and the car disappears. And so you can do editing that way. And it's now editing that's lifted from the pixel space. Like typically when you do scene editing, you would kind of mark a pixel region in the image and you kind of in-paint. Here, we actually just delete like the high-level description or edit the high-level description. You could do the same thing by transplanting an object between a scene view, like I described earlier. You take that scene representation. In this case, we took this car and we just planted it in a different scene. And so as you can see, that the car gets like reasonably kind of transferred over with like lighting and everything adapting to the new scene. And so that also goes somewhat beyond pixel-based in-painting because the shadow of that car stretches all the way across the new scene. And so these are kind of high-level edits that these kind of slot-based representations afford. But now the big question is, how do you go beyond that? And so what we've been kind of thinking about a lot is like, how do you go from object slots to something much more controllable? And so an object slot is a single vector and encoding all aspects of the object, like where it is, all the properties of it, so the model can really render it or like whatever the reconstruction objective is or training objective is can deal with it. But then the idea was effectively, and this is now work that we've just put on the archive with Siyi Wu, who joined us as a student researcher. We extended this to what we call a neural asset. And so a neural asset is effectively a combination of a sequence of vectors capturing the appearance. So instead of just a single vector, we have like a whole sequence of vectors, so much more fine-grained in terms of what appearance it can capture, but also separate pose encoding that really captures all the aspects of like where something is located, all the things you kind of want to control, like in a user interface, basically. And so this all sounds nice, but then the big question is, how do you actually learn that? How do you like learn that so that it can actually control it, so that the appearance is faithful? And all these are difficult questions that are not trivial. And so from neural assets, and I'm taking some slides that Siyi, who's also in the room here, prepared very recently for his final internship presentation. So given a source image with multiple objects, we want to learn a neural representation of each object, and we want to manipulate them in a physically plausible way. So things like we want to translate these objects, we want to rotate them, we, for example, want to rescale them. So, and you can do that all on a per object basis. Here, it's just all objects simultaneously, but that's just like for visualization purposes. And the idea is really to bring controls that you might know from like computer graphics software, to bring them natively into these generative models. And so neural assets are really kind of multi-object 3D control from a single source image. So you start from the source image and then you can control every single thing in there. That's kind of the ultimate goal. Of course, these are limited data sets here. This is way more open. It's mostly cars. And we have some other data sets in the rest of the presentation. So the motivation was really looking at computer graphics workflows. Like in computer graphics, like you can assemble scenes, you can render them, you can, like if you have a physics engine, you can also simulate the scene forward in time, like in this example on the top right. And this is kind of the classical way of doing things. And now in computer graphics workflows, like 3D assets are reusable and they typically have a fixed appearance. You can swap out the texture, but like it takes some effort to change the appearance. The typical way of interacting with that is like you change the pose, like you define where it is. You kind of maybe change some non-rigid aspects of the pose. You have this degrees of freedom in your asset and so forth. And now with neural assets, the idea is basically to have like a learned neural representation of that. So you have a per object representation that is factorized into a disentangled appearance and pose representation. And so now the big question is kind of how do we learn that in practice? And to really learn that, it turns out simply auto-encoding, like what we've mostly done before, isn't sufficient to really learn a proper decomposed representation. It's just an under-constraint problem. Like, how does the model know what you want to control, whether it should just like use all of that latent capacity it has to reconstruct everything, but then you have no control. And so ideally you need like data where the objects are visible in different poses. And what passworks have done is like create synthetic data, like paired data sets of like pre-edit, post-edit, and have like edit annotations. But of course, that's absolutely not scalable. And so the key to unlock this at scale is to find a scalable data source. And we figured that video is actually a really good data source for that, because naturally things change in their posts. You naturally have edits in those scenes, but like you usually don't have annotations for these pre-post edit kind of pairs. But it turns out like computer vision is actually pretty good at kind of detecting stuff and tracking stuff. And so that's typically all you need to get those annotations. Like if you have a detection and tracking model and maybe some depth model or some kind of 3D annotation, you already have a lot of annotations which you can use to invert that problem and to kind of inverse computer vision to do learned graphics, which is more or less like the idea behind this. And so the question is now, how do we disentangle appearance and pose? And so the high level idea is to encode these different aspects from different frames. So we have, for example, a source image where we take, for example, a bounding box around a car, like this van here, and we have a target image where we now want to take the pose of this van in the new image. And so we get the appearance from one frame and we get the pose from the other frame. So the pose encoding knows nothing about the appearance. It literally just gets like an embedding of the 3D bounding box. And the appearance embedding knows a little bit about pose because it gets like an appearance embedding of that crop out in the source image, and that will ultimately always encode a little bit of like pose information. But the pose information from the target image is so much more informative that the model will use that to ultimately render the image. And so, and the key here is also that we reconstruct using an image decoder that target image. So even if the model uses the source pose from the source image, it's not extremely useful to predict where that object is going to be in the target image. So it kind of is forced to use that target pose in the representation, and therefore puts like the controllable pose part of the representation in that pose token and the appearance into that appearance representation. And as an effect, what you get is that the appearance tends to be pose invariant. So you really have like in a 3D asset, like a representation that is pose invariant and even invariant to things like lighting conditions of a scene. Like if you place that asset in a different scene, it adapts to that scene. And that is kind of effectively what we typically would want from an asset. And so the precise architecture of neural assets works a bit like as follows. So again, we have an appearance encoder and a pose encoder, and we try to keep them as simple as possible. So really to make the method as clean and as simple as possible. And so the pose is really just an MLP applied over some corner coordinates of the 3D boxes. And the appearance is effectively just a vision transformer-based image encoder that we fine-tune. Here we take a pre-trained download checkpoint, but we really have to fine-tune it to get the most out of it. And we basically we take a crop out of this feature map using 2D bounding boxes that we have in the source frame. So you need these annotations, you need tracking annotations, and you need 2D and 3D box annotations, which are of course not super easy to get. But if you have those, you can take those assets, you can extract multiple ones from your source video, and then assemble them as a set of assets, including some background asset, and just condition your image diffusion model on that. And so the image diffusion model here is basically just a pre-trained latent diffusion model. And the way we condition it is by not changing anything with the architecture of that diffusion model, but by really just replacing this text token conditioning sequence with an asset token conditioning sequence. So we just swap out that sequence in the existing API. And the background is now encoded basically very similar to like the rest of the assets, but effectively just using a global bounding box to capture everything in the scene, and we mask out the foreground object so it doesn't get confused, and just using like a gray mask. And we can also encode things like, we can either leave the pose empty or encode things like a relative camera pose between those two time steps if you have that information. And so that would also give you like camera controllability in the rendering if you have that information. And so you have like the local assets and like one global asset capturing the background. And so at test time, if you want to control that model, you basically use neural assets as more or less a unified interface where you first encode a scene into that asset representation. And then finally, you can control your generation by controlling the pose, like in this car on the right. You just transform the 3D bounding box by just say, okay, I want to rotate a bounding box, and then you feed that again as a conditioning signal into your image diffusion model at test time, and the image diffusion model renders the car in a new pose. Or if you want to assemble a scene in a new way, or you want to edit a scene, bring in new assets, replace some assets, or assemble the scene from scratch, you basically just put these assets in the conditioning sequence and just see what the model generates. And so if you go over some examples, and you can basically do things like in a 3D graphics engine, you can translate your generation, you can rotate cars, you can rescale them. And it even works if like the car is not fully in view in the source image, the model will still learn an asset representation of it. And when you then ask the model to pull that car into the scene, like in this translation example, it'll find a completion of that car. It's not just going to cut off that car. And these are all test set examples or validation set examples, not seen in the training data. And so the model can also work in like OOD lighting situations. It adapts the assets to that new lighting situation. It's a pre-trained diffusion model, so it knows a lot about the world, and it can adapt to these kinds of things by placing assets correctly into the scene. Finally, you can also do that for indoor scenes. This is trained on the Object-centric data set, which is basically a data set of videos of static scenes, static indoor scenes. So it's really just someone walking around in an indoor scene with a camera and a few outdoor scenes and taking videos of objects, of static objects. And then these are annotated using 3D bounding boxes. And at test time, we can do the same thing. Like we can translate, we can rotate, we can rescale those objects. There's an interesting aspect, which is that object and camera motion are sometimes entangled. For example, in translate, like the whole background translates with it. And that's very likely mostly because the whole data set is only static objects. The only thing that ever moved is the camera. And so it has a harder time disentangling this. But if you now augment this with some data where some objects are actually moving, or there's some more interesting interaction, it would very likely get rid of these issues. And so it's just super interesting to see that the model actually can post hoc rotate the object, even though it has never seen an object rotating in its training data. It always only has ever seen the whole scene and the whole camera rotating, but never the object in isolation. And so there's some really interesting kind of generalization happening in these kinds of models. You can also compose scenes in a new way, like something I've mentioned earlier, like you can drop out tokens, the car disappears. You can isolate or segment individual cars and just leave out the rest. You can swap them between scenes. You can recompose the setup. Like you can put one car in a different location. So you have a lot of creative freedom in basically assembling those scenes. Of course, it's only, again, on those two data sets, way more open and Object-centric. There's a lot more work to be done to really scale that. But so far, and we'll talk about limitations in a moment, but so far, a lot of the things we hoped would work actually work pretty much straight out of the box when we started applying the final model on these two different data sets. Now, you can also apply, like do background replacement. And maybe I should say, of course, there's a lot of work behind to make this work and a lot of trial and error to get this ultimately right. Like even like getting these bounding boxes, masking the foreground to get a background representations. All of these are kind of little iterations C and the team has done to really make that work well. So it's not as straightforward as it may sound like, but there, ultimately what you get out of it is you get a lot of controllability, including things like background replacement. So you can start by taking the scenes at the top and place the assets in that background of the scene in the middle, or you can even place them in this night scene. And one interesting thing that surprised us is that the renderings really adapt to turn even the headlights and the lights of the cars on in that new scene. And so there's some really interesting compositionality and adaptation going on just by having this kind of structural representation underlying the generative process. I want to highlight some failure cases and limitations. Like one failure case we've seen in Object-tron is that it doesn't always perform a full rotation. And that's very likely because it only sees like the videos of the data set are typically not a full like 360 camera like swivel around the object, but really just mostly like a person walking with a camera, just changing perspective a little bit. And that way you get a bit of that overfitting into the model. So like the handle is always on the right side in the top mug and always on the left side in the bottom mug, even though you ask it to rotate it all the way around. And in some early versions of the model, we also had things like cars can be sticky to lanes. Like that's also one form of overfitting, that the cars kind of follow the prompt. In the left-hand example, it kind of follows the prompt correctly. In the right example, it really tries to kind of stick the cars into their lanes where they belong and doesn't want to deviate from that. And generally, it can do things that are far outside the training distribution. Like it cannot flip a car upside down, it cannot lift it into the air, etc. Like an interesting question is really like when do we see these things emerging? Like, do we actually ever need to see a car flipped upside down or lifted into the air in a training data set? Or is it sufficient to see some other things flying in the air and then the model generalizes? That is going to be really interesting to see as these models are being scaled. At this point, it's a small data set, 160K frames and Waymo open roughly. And so there's not a lot of diversity. So hopefully in the future, when these models are being scaled, you can get like the full kind of diversity of control that you would expect from a computer graphics tool and beyond. And so to conclude, I think in summary, like controllability is really kind of a new frontier in representation learning and also object-centric representation learning, because we have these generative models now where we can expect how these representations are controlled. We can literally just always render any kind of intervention, and we can really just like intuitively see failure modes. We only scratched the surface of this so far. Of course, like there's no benchmarks really for that kind of capability. We, as a community, don't really have proper evaluations. Like building up all this infrastructure as a community will be really important to kind of bridge this gap from like these current like high quality generative models that are hardly controllable to like the future where everything is like controllable in like a fine-grained way, and we can really build like controllable world models and use them to solve fantastic problems. And so representation structure really matters, which is like one of the few cases I think where we see like an example of like going against the mainstream of like just like unstructured big transformer-based representations, but really like thinking hard about what the structure of the representation should be to get these types of control. And I think that is like an exciting time for the future, because like I think we've seen a lot of progress in like text and multimodal based learning, and text usually was like making up for the lack of underlying structure, because of language itself is so much structure and so intuitive to us that it makes up for like a lack of representation structure. But if you want to go beyond that and enable other types of control, like basically some kind of clickable user interface, suddenly you need to start thinking about structure again in your representations. How do you structure representation? How do you make it editable, and so forth? And so open questions and next steps. There's quite a few interesting questions coming up, especially relating back to like the topic of the workshop, robotics. Are these more controllable representations also better for robotic policy learning? That's an interesting question that no one has the answer for. Intuitively, it kind of makes sense, but of course we don't know. So that's something I would hope the community can find out. And then there's also user interface questions. Like we have like the community has conversion like user interfaces for 3D graphics tools. we're now seeing this new wave of like text-to-image, text-to-video models. Like there being startups formed around like just creating like great tools and user interfaces, but no one really knows what the right user interface for this type of controllability will be in the future. And so there's like really interesting UI research to be done. And then, of course, it's just capabilities. Like this is just like 3D rigid pose and scale, of course, but like ultimately we want to have controls beyond rigid pose and be able to articulate aspects of objects and animate them and so forth. Like there's a lot of work to be done. This is really only the start. And so with that, I'd like to thank the team behind slot attention, dorsal, neural assets, and all the other work I've mentioned here. And of course, like the work in the community, I think the community has really made quite some progress over the last couple of years in this space. And we have a few minutes for any questions or discussion points. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure if we need a microphone. The room is not too big. So Zoom. For Zoom, yeah.
I can repeat the question.
Repeat the question, yeah. For Zoom. Like, are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great talk. I want to ask, how do you see the role of pre-training models for object-centric learning? Because they're trained with not so object-centric in that devices.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what we've followed here is basically we start from pre-trained models. Like the image diffusion model is a large-scale pre-trained image diffusion model. The image encoder is a large-scale pre-trained image model. And that is really something where I think starting from these models is going to be key in the future because you don't want to like build up a new paradigm completely from scratch. You want to really start with whatever big foundation models are out there and add these capabilities and add this kind of structure. That's a more pragmatic way. Of course, there's an interesting question of like, does it make sense to reinvent everything from scratch? Maybe, but I think for now we really should embrace like pre-trained large-scale models and think of that more like as adding capabilities on top. Great question, thanks. I did not repeat the question. So the question was, like, should we use pre-trained model in this context of like object-centric learning? Yeah, one question.
The slot attention line of work, I'm curious with your thoughts on how that could be extended to scene-level objects.
Which attention line of work? Sorry.
The slot attention.
Oh, slot attention line of work.
Because it's usually over like tabletop or like clever like settings. But like imagine if you wanted to build scene graph-like representations, which are also object-centric in some sense.
Yeah. So the question was like, how can you extend like the slot attention line of approaches to these kind of more complex scenes? And I think so now that we've kind of converged or like found this really controllable way of representing assets in environments, and I think like one key here is to really have multiple appearance tokens, not just one, and also have like separated out control. Like there's really big question of how do you combine that with like these more attention-based like mappings between images and tokens. Like ROI align really is just a stopgap solution here. It's like pretty, like it has a lot of problems. Like you basically just say everything within this like 2D bounding box is going to be relevant for the asset, which is in practice it's not, because you get a bit of background stuff in there. And so you ultimately do want, I think, an attention-based mapping to go from this grid-based image representation to these asset representations. And we just don't know like what's the best mechanism for that. I think one can try just replacing ROI align with some cross-attention mechanism. Slot attention by itself will probably not cut it, because you do want multiple tokens, because if you just use one token, the appearance is too poor and that doesn't have the right structure. So I think that's a really interesting question there that the community has to address, I think. Okay.
I have a question. How would you learn the neural asset representation help global manipulation?
Oh yeah, so the question is like, how would a neural asset representation help robot manipulation? And I mean, this was one question I have at the end of the talk because I don't have an answer for. So basically, how are more controllable representations also better for robotic policy learning? I mean, one thing one can try is basically just like take this encoder, get all the neural assets, and plug that into a policy learning pipeline and see what happens. Just like how we've how colleagues have done like OSRT representation, plug them into policy logging pipeline or like a robotics pipeline. We don't know the answer. I think someone has to try it. I could see this go either way. Like on the one hand, these appearance representations are now pose invariant. Do we really want pose invariant representations for robotics? Maybe, maybe not. And yeah, that's something we just don't know yet. I think people have to try. It's an empirical question.
Yeah, somewhat related to the previous question about scene representation. If we want to represent scenes like, you know, Shibuya crossing, where you have hundreds of pedestrians crossing the street,
yeah,
does this object level representation scale when you're trying to track hundreds of objects or represent scenes with hundreds of objects?
So the question is, does this kind of representation scale if you have like hundreds of objects, like a busy pedestrian crossing? And I would say yes. I mean, ultimately, if you look at like, if you ask someone like to design a scene from scratch in a computer graphics tool, their workflow is maybe like they create a few assets like humans, they place them in the scene, and then they animate them. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be able to do that ultimately with these kinds of methods. Like we have detection and segmentation methods that can scale to hundreds of thousands of objects. If you can get out their representations, annotate them, and then condition on like, we also have like generative models that can condition on like millions of tokens. So I think like you can probably kind of fit a lot into that window and do controllability that way. Maybe that one. Yeah. Perfect. Oh, sorry. I think that question was first, and then we go. Yeah.
I think Wayne was pretty keen annotation. Study what happens if annotations are not as clear, maybe even sparsely.
So that's a great question. If you studied what happens if the annotations aren't as clear as in these examples here, because Waymo Open and also Object-Tron, these annotations are pretty much perfect. Not perfect, like Object-Tron has some issues, but I think like we haven't studied in detail, but my answer is that an image diffusion model or any generative model that maps from any input to any output learns a distribution. And if that distribution is like, if it's not biased, but it's just like some random noise in the boxes, like if you had random noise in the boxes, it just learns a one-to-many mapping. And that one-to-many mapping might be fine for creative applications. Like every time you kind of sample from the model, the object might like end up in a slightly different pose, but roughly where I want it to be. And I think for a first, like it's not a blocker to actually build useful applications that way. Of course, like the better the annotations, the better the tool will be. But like in a first instantiation, I don't think annotation quality will be the main limitation. I think you can even get quite far with coarse annotations, like maybe just a point on the object, or just a rough 2D box or scribble or something like that. Okay, your question, sorry.
Yeah, so like objects are composed of parts. Have you thought of, instead of having like multiple appearance vectors, you try to like, you know, have an appearance vector for like the wheel or something like that, and then learn that composability?
That's a great question. So objects are composed of parts. Have we looked into like having a composable part-based representation? We have not, but I think it still fits within that framework where you can put, like right now, it's just an unstructured sequence of vectors, the appearance, and the pose just a single global vector of a pose. But you can actually structure that in any way you like, just like how people structure assets in computer graphics in any way they like. They can add different degrees of freedom. I think like as long as you can kind of annotate it and detect these parts and label them, you can invert the process and structure your representation that way. And I think that will be a recipe. We can get all of these things in there. Fully unsupervised, again, I don't know how this works. Like we've tried that for many years. It's a hard problem. Maybe in the future someone will figure it out, but like fully unsupervised is very, very hard to solve the problem. Maybe one more question, yeah.
First about orientation, about the difference between the individual slot encoding used in slot and the unified decoding used in slate.
Oh, that's a great question. So the question is about like how to like on an intuition level, the individual slot decoder used in slot attention, where we have one CNN per slot, versus like later methods like slate and also these kinds of methods where you have more like a cross attention based decoder that does everything simultaneously. I think we really need to go towards like more general architectures, and the driving metrics for success will be efficiency. Like decoding every slot individually is just not efficient. Like if you run a decoder, if you have 1,000 tokens describing a scene, and every single thing has to be decoded every time using an expensive generative model, it's just not going to work, or not going to scale. Like these video generative models right now, like the latest models that are just announced like the last few days, they take like, I don't know, 2 minutes to generate a few seconds of a clip. If now you do 1000x that, if you want to populate a scene, that's not going to work. And so the answer is like whatever is like the most efficient decoder. And right now these are for high fidelity decoding, these are either nerve based or Gaussian splitting based for 3D, or like diffusion models, image video diffusion models for images and videos.